Cette écoute 𝐿BE.
Sandi, Cammie, how are you? It's so wonderful for you to be here.
We are so delighted to be with you, 𝐿BE. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to this.
You have no idea. So for context, I met Sandi and Cammie, I think through a mutual connection, and I was on your podcast, Money Talks, a few months ago. We
Money
were talking
Tales.
about money, which is a very important topic that people never want to talk about. And so I'm excited to talk to you about money today. We got to keep this money conversation going. Before we get started, I want to ask you, where are your people from? And I'm going to allow Cammie to start. So Cammie, where are your people from? Where are you from?
Thanks for asking. I would say my people are from the former Yugoslavia. So all my grandparents came from Yugoslavia in their late teens, early 20s, and really made their life here. And then eventually I was born and raised in Southern California. So I also think about my connection there, my people from. Now I'm in Northern California.
Is there a huge population of Yugoslavians in Southern California? Like, how did your parents meet? Because they're
You
both
are
first
it's
generation immigrants, right?
first generation immigrants meeting through the community, and it's surprisingly quite large. Yeah.
Very good.
Isn't that, I know, surprising.
Fantastic. And Sandi, where are your people from?
I am the third generation born in the United States. Beyond that, it gets really sketchy. My people were from different parts of Russia and Ukraine and other countries that don't exist today. And it doesn't go back, the details aren't available beyond my great-grandparents. So I grew up in Southern California, and I too live in Northern California now.
I love it. I love it. So you both, as a pair and individually, are money talking queens. And when I say that, just such an advocate of just having conversations around money, whether it's with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, but just being more public and open about what money is, how it flows, and how we can make more of it. So, my first question to you, both of you, is when did you first have your first conversation about money? A strategic, intentional money conversation with a human. We'll start with Sandi. Who was the human and how did we get there in the first place?
I'm going to answer by telling you about my first impactful money conversation as an adult. I had been working for a company for 5.5 years. I didn't like what I was doing. I knew I wanted to make my way into the financial planning space. And I navigated a job to the job that I have today. This was nearly 26 years ago. And when I was interviewing for the position, I was offered a role at a compensation package level that was below what I had been paid previously, or what I was making at the time, I should say. So to take a pay cut if I was going to move to this company. I told you I spoiled the punchline here because I ended up making that move. But at the time I talked with my father. He's someone that I always had lots of open money conversations with, and he thought I was nuts. He thought I was crazy. I'd been working for a multinational firm. I had a great position. My career looked golden. And he's like, "Why would you give that all up and take a step backwards?" And the reason why I ultimately decided to do that is because I was not happy in the role that I had. I had no purpose. I had no meaning. I had a tyrant of a boss who made me cry on multiple occasions each week. And I just couldn't stand it. And I knew in my heart of hearts I wanted to work in the financial planning profession. And I thought, well, geez, I don't have any other responsibilities beyond myself at this point. If I'm ever going to make a move like this is the time. I want to learn. And I needed more than just money at that time. I needed a career pivot to where my heart really was. And I made that decision, and it turned out to be the best money decision that I've ever made.
Before we go further, let's clarify for the family that is watching. It sounds like you made this decision, you did get a decrease in pay, but you were still able to live the lifestyle you wanted to live with that like how did that decrease in pay impact your bills, your lifestyle, buying milk at the store? Was there a serious impact, or did you have some flexibility with that decrease in pay?
That's a really good question. I did have some flexibility. So the part of my life that was impacted was really my discretionary spending, right? My vacations weren't as nice. I didn't go out as much. I cooked food at home more often. Within a few years, I was able to make up ground and then some. So again, it all worked out. But I lived leaner for a few years, and I, um, I did that intentionally.
Cammie, what about you? When was your first real conversation, intentional conversation about money?
Yeah, I would say it's an interesting, I love these. Here I am saying a co-host Money Tales. We talk about money all the time, but when the microphone turns and it's my turn, you realize, wow. So, so this upbringing of immigrant parents or grandparents, we were taught to really work hard, save, save, save. And that was the message. And it really landed with me. But it's funny how these same messages can land differently to different siblings. And my middle brother was more like spend, enjoy life, live nicely. And so I'm coming out of college and I get my first job, and it's sort of my dream job. I'm going to work in sports marketing. Actually, it was sports fashion, and I was heading up marketing. And I didn't care what they paid because I landed my dream job. And so I'm telling this to my brother, who said, that's great, Cammie. I am so happy you got your great job, and you're telling me money doesn't matter, but it does matter. Maybe not, you don't want the same things I want, but you want to go on trips with your friends. He was pointing out that I do need money for things I enjoy, and that don't just turn money off and say it just doesn't matter and let the world control whatever I get paid, that it's okay to advocate and to want to be paid the right amount of money, and so I always look back on that conversation as a really important one, because at first I was in denial. No, Jeff, you don't understand me. Then I sat with it and I realized how right he was.
My first conversation, strategic conversation as an adult around money, was when I realized that I was getting screwed over on my paycheck. Because I grew up in this world of like, you just don't talk about money. And I think a lot of us do. So tell me more about that. Why is it, I would argue until recently, I would say the last 10 to 15 years, it was very shunned upon to just talk about money with anyone, minus like your close circle, usually people who are affected by the money that you're bringing in. Why was there so much shame around that?
I can start, Cammie, unless you want to jump in.
Go for it, Sandy.
I would say there's a lot of societal pressures. We're shown all sorts of money messages all day long on screens, on paper, on our phones. There's lots of messages around money, and we're taught not to speak about it. Even today, a lot of people still don't feel great speaking about it. And I think there's something about money that attracts our emotions. We become very emotional about it. And those emotions might be very positive, they might not be. But we're really taught as a society to keep those emotions to ourselves. So even when we want to have money conversations, many of us clam up because it just feels different. It doesn't feel natural. We don't have the vocabulary oftentimes. We have to wrestle with those feelings. And I think it's really interesting to acknowledge that. And what we're trying to do, Lexi B, as you know, is help people move beyond that. Because when you start having these conversations, you realize there's so much to learn from one another. And by having these conversations and telling these stories, we end up learning a lot about ourselves as well. I can remember a few years back, I've two kids who are teenagers now, but at the time they were in elementary school. And my husband and I wanted to talk the talk. We wanted to make sure we were having very open money conversations with our children. And I remember sitting around the dinner table with them, telling them about money and about the money of our family. And they asked really good questions. Well, Mom and Dad, how much money do you make? how much money does our house cost? And I remember when they were asking those questions, I had this big ball, like this big knot in my gut. Just, I had this feeling that it was wrong to share that information with them. And I stepped back and I questioned that. Well, why was I feeling that way? And they were young. They didn't really understand the numbers, but we talked through it. And we talked a lot about the privacy of the information. We didn't call it a secret, but we talked about how we wanted to share information. We wanted to keep certain things private. Anyway, Lexi B, there's all kinds of reasons people have for not talking about money, but most of them are learned behaviors in our society.
And I think
I love
you're
how you
right.
had that conversation. Oh no,
Sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was
Go ahead.
the secrecy versus privacy, I think, is a big, right? Were you going to hit on that? In
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
previous generations, it was you keep it secret, you almost hide it. It was, and then it wasn't discoverable, so we hide it over here. And there were also ways you flaunted it, though, with maybe what you bought and wore and showed off in different ways. But there was something taboo. Again, it was more you hold this vessel secret. Now, perhaps with the internet and where information is searchable, maybe that's unlocked a little bit where people realize, oh, I can't keep it as secretive. But still, we find through our conversations on Money Tales and what we're continue to advocate is the more we feel comfortable, the more it will unlock and connect us to our values and things that are important to us, and unlock us from shame or even fear. And so privacy, secrecy, there's just some great opportunities to continue to change this conversation.
And that is wild, Cammie, isn't it? That you can go online and you can find out how much someone paid for their house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's so much information we can find out about each other. And I know people who will go and look rather than ask the question.
Ooh,
And so I
interesting.
think there is magic in asking the question and learning more, because when we don't talk, when we just hunt and peck for information, we end up making judgments about other people. And it's those judgments, I think, that can really get in the way of our relationships.
I think people don't talk about money also because that keeps people poor. And I think there's this beautiful PR campaign around not talking about money. Because when you look at the history of societies that are building financial wealth, there's a history where the rich are talking about money. Okay. You cannot tell me that Daddy Kennedy was not up in that house in the East Coast talking to his 85,000 Kennedy children about money and the Kennedy Trust. And this is how it works. And every time one of those children brought somebody home, okay, to possibly marry, you're not going to tell me Daddy Kennedy was like, we need to have a conversation. Okay. You're not going to tell me the Vanderbilts didn't do it. You're not going to tell me the Chases didn't do it. You're not going to tell me the Rockefellers didn't do it. And as a person who went to a very elite college with a lot of rich people, sitting freshman year at the breakfast table eating waffles and hearing 18-year-olds talk about money, conversations I've never had, I was like, that's very interesting. And so I've always thought that part of the shame around talking about money was to keep people poorer, because one of the ways to unlock your power with money is to actually start talking about it. And I think there's possibly a shame with capitalism, which I think messes all of us up, about this idea that if you do not have a certain amount of money, then you feel shame to talk to people about your money, when you're like, well, they may have more money than I do, so I don't look as good at the table. Does that make sense? But that's what I learned in college. I was like, yo, a lot of people are talking about money. It's the 1%. But their parents are making sure they're not going to mess up the family trust. So yeah.
And it's an
Like, see, I
interesting
think
how you framed this conversation that you were overhearing. It was not necessarily talking about money, it was showing money and setting some sort of status level, versus wouldn't it have been great if you had had a conversation with them and they start talking about, yeah, we learned about our parents set up this trust and there was some knowledge sharing and it was educational and collaborative, versus maybe more of a what sounds like a status setup.
And I just want to share too, in our work that we do at Experian, we work with a lot of individuals and families who have created immense wealth for themselves. And I see a difference there as well, because when people create wealth, they grew up in a socioeconomic situation that's very different than they're in today. And I think in those situations, the conversations about money with the rising generations of the family aren't always as easy. I don't know that those families are always talking about money. It can be awkward because the children are growing up in a socioeconomic situation that's very different than the parents are. And so oftentimes the two generations aren't really able to empathize with each other because they haven't been in each other's shoes before. And that's been really fascinating work, and the role I play working with clients as their wealth manager, bringing those conversations to the forefront, helping the family think through what are the shared values and what are the shared experiences, and how can they relate to each other around the wealth that they have in the family and the plans that they're making for that wealth.
I would also just like to add that during those conversations around waffles, I was the person that pretended to know what they were talking about. So I also at 18 had shame. I was like, I have no idea what a 529 is and what is about this investment stock. But I was like, I'm going to sit here and fake it till I make it with the
Because that's
rocket.
how people talk about money.
I'm
But
so
Yes.
glad you brought that
like
up, because
bragging and
it's
I know
so
everything.
common.
Yeah.
Right. And then I like write things down, and then I would go back to my laptop and Google like, so what kind of trust is that? Right. Like, because people were having conversations, saying things like, if I don't get good grades, I will be written out of the trust. And I was like, what's a trust? Let me go Google that later. But yes, I hear you.
I understand that.
Continue. Right. And it was a very interesting dynamic as a teenager. Yeah.
Well, I think that's really fascinating, because what you mentioned is something that a lot of people can relate to and no one's talking about. And could you imagine if you had felt comfortable being at that table saying, hey, wait a second, I haven't heard of that before. Can you explain what's going on? Like, that would be an amazing transformation, right? You could have learned from your peers. And that's what Cammie and I are trying to do with the Money Tales podcast. We're trying to open up these conversations, to normalize them, to make sure that there's no judgment, there's no shame. We're not born with knowledge about personal finances. It's a learned and acquired skill set to understand how this works. And unfortunately, the way personal finances work in this country is there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown in, right?
Yes.
The 529 plan is a perfect example. That's just the name of the code, the tax code, in which it was set up under. But it has like this mystical meaning for people who aren't familiar with that. So I think changing some of the language would be helpful too. And that's part of what we can get into when we're talking about money productively with other people.
So let's go deep. How do we talk about money with our family? And when I say the word family, I'm specifically talking about parents and siblings, because I do think that is a sore subject for people, especially as they get older, especially if you have someone in the family that is trying to make more money than maybe the lifestyle they had growing up, and then coming home to that Sunday dinner or to that Mother's Day, and it is clear that they are making more money than maybe other people at the table, and it gets very uncomfortable. I actually know a lot of people who have decreased the amount of time they spend with their family because of this. So what are some tips and tricks to have some strategic conversations without family ties being broken around the dollar?
I'd say
start.
first and
Oh, sorry.
go ahead. No, Cammie,
Okay.
go.
I would say invite them to the conversation. Like ask if it's okay. I think it's really nice to say, I'd love to talk about this. And I'd add that there's a really soft way you can bring conversation around money by telling stories and saying, God, I remember when grandma used to da-da-da, and this is what I took from it. And through that storytelling can be a really nice way to ease into the conversation.
And I would add to that, go into the conversations with curiosity. And withhold your judgment. And this is really hard. When we're with our families, we tend to fall back into the relationships, to the dynamics that we had when we were young, even though we might be full-fledged adults at this point. So trying to be mindful of that and stay away from that and come into the conversation with curiosity. Hey, mom and dad, what do you think about this? Or I had this experience the other day and I want to share it with you. I'm curious about your thoughts. I think there are ways to finesse the conversations. And I would add one other point, which is you don't have to have all of these conversations at one time. It's not a one and done. You can build on them. So start
I was like,
slow.
Thanksgiving got really uncomfortable and also very long, but continue. Like, we can break this up.
That's right. You kind of draw a little boundary. Sometimes where we love to start on the podcasting, you know this, Lexi, is asking about your experience as a child. When did money first have meaning? How many people ask their parents that? It's a wonderful way to understand and to relate with them a little bit further because they can share their experience. You can ask questions if you have them. And then you can move into, well, here's what I learned growing up in our household. And these were the things that I took away. And I think that sort of storytelling can be really meaningful, especially among siblings. I have two siblings myself. I'm the oldest. My brother is 7.5 years younger than me. It was like we grew up in two different families. The whole situation, the family changed during that 7.5 years. So there's been so much for us to learn about each other's experiences. And so again, that curiosity and storytelling can be really helpful in these conversations.
So now, we're encouraging people to talk about money. How do you do that? So I love the tips and tricks for your family. It's more of an intimate dynamic. But are we suggesting that we just like walk down to the corner store and be like, yo, Stacy, how much is in your pocket? Like, how do we start? Right? And I do not suggest that. Where I come from, that's called having no couth. Don't do that to Stacy. But how do we do that, right? When we're talking to people that are not in our insular family, that we do not have the most intimate relationship with, maybe people who have not wiped your bottom before, right? How do we bring money up? Because I would argue, at least in my journey, it was the people that were not my family that have actually taught me the most about
Mm.
money. And how I got to that point was always windy and weird, and I felt it was awkward. But I was so grateful that I could finally be like, look, let's talk about my bank account and how you need to help me make it better. How do we get there?
I think the tips and tricks are very similar to the ones that we talked about with family. So asking for permission to be in a conversation because you don't want to come at someone and surprise them. That can make them feel uncomfortable, especially if you're ready to share information that they might not be ready to hear. Having curiosity, having withholding judgment, and oftentimes I find that it's helpful to have these conversations when I can preface it with some context about why I'm asking the question or what I'm struggling with or what I'm trying to achieve and that I want the other person's insight on. So it might be related to a job. Hey, I got this awesome job opportunity, but they want to pay me 20% less than I'm making right now. This feels scary. This feels like it's a bad decision. I'm curious, have you ever been in this place before? What guidance do you have?
I'd even say start with your inner circle too. Start small. You don't need to go talk to who was it, Jenny at the corner store or whomever. Starting with your inner circle, getting comfort. Um, I think it's also about when you're in those conversations, you can even do like a little segue. And this isn't a plug for Money Tales or the Sit with Lexi B, but you could reference, hey, I was listening to this podcast. They asked this really interesting question that I never talked to my friends about. Like, do you ask for raises? That's an interesting one. Do you ever ask for a raise? Because Sandy and I were just talking to a mutual friend who said I've never asked for a raise. It's just not my thing.
Cammie, you should know now about me. I am always underpaid until I am well overpaid. I ask
I
for everything. The kitchen
I
sink, your cat, your dog's lung. I ask for it all and all the time. Yes.
I think it's great. I'm encouraging people to ask because if we that others ask and they get, and if you don't ask, you might not get. So I'm with you. I think we should. But I think pulling in, I was reading a book, I heard this, I read this, it softens it. Sandy already sort of introduced this idea. What's your thought on this? And it just creates this great, because it's a conversation. And it's so empowering. And I was with some girlfriends recently, and when you do open it up, you find people just dive in and like, yes, I want to have this conversation.
And I have to say, like, you could be at a cocktail party and ask a very evocative money question to see what comes up. One of my favorite is, "Hey, tell me, what's the purpose of money in your life?" I mean,
Sandy, I love
that's
it.
heavy and wild, but if you want to get to know someone, if you want to connect with someone, ask that question and see what they share with you. They might walk away. That would be okay. But chances are they're going to answer the question and you're going to have a conversation that's going to surprise you and incite you and hopefully excite you as well.
So I'm married, so I have not done a first date in a long time. But I think that we should also add that question to the dating list of questions. That question is so powerful. Can you say it one more time? What is the question?
What is the purpose of money in your life?
That needs to be a first date question. First, second, and third. You need to bring that question back on the 6 month anniversary. Because I'm like, that's the question. That
And,
is, that's the
and what you're
question.
pointing out, Lexi, is that the answer to that question is constantly evolving and changing. And that's part of the magic. It is a great question to ask all the time. It's a great question to ask yourself, ask your partner, ask your parents, ask your siblings, ask your coworkers. It's really interesting, and I think it gets to the meat of the essence of our lives, because when you really dive into it, you realize that money has no purpose in and of itself. It's the purpose of your life. It's the purpose that you cast onto the money and the purpose that you give money as its role in your life.
So then now I'm going to ask you both, what is the purpose of money in your life?
For me, it's something to talk about.
To
I love it. I love it. Okay.
me,
It's
it
not what
is.
you were
It's
expecting, was it?
freedom. It is. It's freedom to do the things I believe in and that light me up. And but it's not. It's not the symbol of success.
And I'll give you a more real answer, and that is, for me, it's security. It's knowing that I have what I need to cover all of the expenses, the savings, the giving away that I want to do in my life. That's really important for me to have that control, and money provides that.
So, how do we talk about money to the next generation? So, let's pretend that we have passed with flying colors, Cammie and Sandi, Money 101, 102, 103, 210, and we are masters at money talking. And it's time to teach the next generation the lessons and the gems. Whether you're a parent, whether you're an auntie, whether you're an uncle, there's always going to be some type of child in your life. How do we prepare them better? How do we start having that conversation with the kiddos?
Just
Okay, maybe I'll
start.
let you take
Yeah,
this.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna. I am. I think it is really. It's super critical. So I've got a 10 and an 8 year old, and there's no perfect conversation. Don't wait for it to be perfect. Let it be part of your conversation, and use that same idea of curiosity, asking them questions. I've got two kids who want different things with money. One wants to give it away. One can spend it faster than it hits her wallet. The other one wants to save it forever, but you don't know why. Why is that? She actually wants to buy a building to sell cookies out of, but that's a different story. But I think even just being in those conversations and asking why, talking about our values around money, and why we spend it in certain places and not other places, I think is so critical. It's never too early.
And I would add to that, helping the children, regardless of how young or old they are, connect the money with the purpose of their life. And not everyone knows the purpose of their life early on, and not everyone has a single purpose, right? Purpose is an evolving thing, but trying to create that connection is helpful. I'm one of those parents who, on long drives, when we're driving down to LA to visit family, there's no screens going on. We're all talking together. It's sort of forced family time. And I'll use that as an opportunity to educate our children about money. Like we'll talk about different things. We'll talk about, well, what's insurance? What's a mortgage? So we have very personal finance focused competence and skill building conversations. And then I would also add that talking about money is super important when it comes to actually raising children and having an influence on children. I think modeling money is also very important. And if you can model money and have a money conversation along with it, I think you're really doing the young person or young people some great value. So I'll give you an example. When my daughter was younger, I used to take her shopping with me, and I'm busy. I don't have time to shop very often. So I would tend to go to a store and buy a lot of things at once. And I realized I was modeling something terrible for my daughter because she thought, like, you just go to the store and you hoard. And so we broke that down and we talked about it. And we talked about, well, why do we need an array of clothes and how long should they last? And we just kind of broke it down so that she could understand it a little bit more. And then I stopped taking her shopping with me for a while because I thought it just wasn't serving her or me well in the way I thought it'd be fun to spend some time with her. Anyway.
That's a great story, Sandy. I think it's really important. I'll just add one of our podcast guests brought in a game to teach her kids, and Monopoly is an example of this, but it was called Cash Flow 101. And she really wanted her kids to learn about money. And I thought, what a great idea. There are games out there. I didn't look into Cash Flow 101, so I'm not trying to say it's the best one, but how interesting. There's games out there you can play that can facilitate learning and conversations. So there's a lot of tools out there.
So what I learned was, one, nothing like a Sandi car ride. Because you're not going nowhere. We gonna talk about
You're right, Lexi. I've heard her. She gets deep.
Nothing like a
She
Sandi car.
unlocks things.
And two, I love the idea of games. Recently, about a year ago, I watched this documentary on Monopoly. And as a person who's played Monopoly for forever, until this documentary, I actually hated the game of Monopoly. I was like, this takes too long. All the family members add new rules. It's like Uno, but I actually enjoy Uno. Like how much money you gotta go to jail. I used to hate it. I'm like, we're gonna be here all night long on this fake money. I watched a documentary about Monopoly and how it came to be, and started really understanding how we are teaching these babies about money. And I looked over to my spouse and I was like, I just don't know if I want Monopoly to be the game that we teach our child around money, because it's just so intense, right? The purpose of the game is to buy everything. Like, I'm at the top of the world with all this money. And he looked at me and he was like, yeah, we got to find a different game. But the idea of using games and play for kids, I think, is very important, considering that's how kids learn everything else, right?
You're
Lexi,
amazing.
You're reminding me of something that we did with our children when they were younger. We would give them, I would give them money quarterly because I just couldn't remember to do it every week. And I called it practice money. Here's money. You can decide what you can spend it on. Here's what Dad and I are going to cover. This is your money. Go practice it with it. And after about a year, the kids came back and they're like, Mom, why are we calling it practice money? Like, that's stupid. We're not practicing with it. We're actually using it. And I thought, oh, you're right. Like, let's just call it a quarterly dividend. We had another conversation about what that meant. More learning. But yeah, it's really interesting. So that brings me to just one other tip, which is there is something very powerful about giving your children money to use and to begin spending. And if you give them amounts where they can't really hurt themselves, but they can maybe do a little bit of damage where they learn, that's the best thing, because you want them to learn to keep money safe by losing $20 instead of $100 or whatever the case might be. But that would be one other thing to do along with these money conversations. And then checking in with them to learn, how did you make a decision about how you spent that money? What was going through your mind? Not as a judgment question, but really just as a learning, and to give them an opportunity to reflect and learn from them for themselves.
I'm over here thinking about Monopoly and going, that's not a good message for my kids. It's a win-lose. Sorry, I'm still stuck on Monopoly.
Different
It's a
episode.
win-lose.
But TLDR, y'all. It turns out Monopoly was actually built by this woman, created by this woman, to literally teach children how trying to be a billionaire is destructive. So she created the original Monopoly board, and the whole idea was like, see, Tommy won the game. Tommy, look at all your friends. They have no money, which means they can't feed themselves, and they're poor and they're sad. So Tommy, you should give money out, right? It was like this
Wow.
guilt
And
shame thing of
interestingly,
like,
though, there have been some studies that show that as you earn more money, even in a game of Monopoly where it's not really money, you begin to feel more powerful. And that's not the message that most people take away.
exactly. And so some man, of course it's a man, basically found the game and said, wait a minute, this should be marketed differently. And now we have the monopoly that we have. But the original intent was to teach children about capitalism and about a monopoly on the market, and how you owning everything or you having everything, how that affects other people, and so we should share. Highly recommend it. It was
I can't wait to watch it.
it was a very insightful 90-minute experience.
It's on my list.
And now I'm like, my kid can never play Monopoly. I'm so terrified. Before we end it, I would like to ask both of you to reintroduce yourselves. So Cammie, who are you?
Well, I'm Cammie Doder. I am a CMO two times over. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐿, and I'm the Chief Mommy Officer at home.
And Sandi, who are you?
I'm Sandi Bragar. I'm Chief Client Officer at 𝐟𝐴, and I'm someone who believes that having productive money conversations will help make the world a better place for all of us.
Ditto to that. I agree. So TLDR, folks, talk about your money. Talk about your money and level up in that conversation of the things that you can learn. Thank you both for so much for joining me today and hanging out. This was wonderful.
It was
So much
so
fun.
fun.
Thank you again for having us.
Of course.